If you found this reader's guide helpful, please consider pledging your support to Voice of Geekdom on Patreon and gain access to premium content. Last time on The Silmarillion Explained, we read about the tumultuous breaking of the Siege of Angband, which began one cold winter's night with great rivers of fire and clouds of toxic fumes, which spread suddenly across the plain of Ardgallen and originated from Thangorodrim. Morgoth unleashed his armies against the Noldor, led by the great worm Glaurung. The forces of Angband attacked the fortress at Sirion, killing Hador, the Lord of Dor Lomin, and a close friend of Fingolfin, as well as Angrod and Aignor, two of the sons of Finarfin, and Bregolas, the incumbent lord of the House of Beor. We also learned that Finrod, as he marched north from Nargothrond to join the fighting, had been waylaid by orcs at the Fen of Serek, where the river Sirion meets its tributary, the Rivil. He was rescued from the orcs by Barahir, a man of the House of Beor and brother of Bregolas, though many of his people were lost in the effort. In gratitude, Finrod swore a solemn oath of friendship to Barahir and to all of his household, pledging to give them his aid at need. Hello, Tolkien geeks! In the aftermath of the Dagor Bragolak, Fingolfin was faced with huge losses of both territory and people, including, as we have recently read, his mortal friend Hador, who had died protecting him. Fingolfin was surely demoralised and despondent at Morgoth's crushing victory at Sirion, and perhaps feeling guilty about the death of Hador. But when the news arrived of the loss and destruction of the highlands of Dorthonion, and the retreat of the sons of Feanor, something broke inside him, and he descended into rage and despair. What comes next is a famous Silmarillion moment, a favourite amongst fans, and an event which has already been foreshadowed and directly referenced in earlier chapters. Fingolfin beheld, as it seemed to him, the utter ruin of the Noldor, and the defeat beyond redress of all their houses, and filled with wrath and despair, he mounted upon Rochalor, his great horse, and rode forth alone, and none might restrain him. He passed over Dor Anfauglith like a wind amid the dust, and all that beheld his onset fled in amaze, thinking that Orome himself was come, for a great madness of rage was upon him, so that his eyes shone like the eyes of the Valar. Thus he came alone to Angband's gates, and he sounded his horn, and smote once more upon the brazen doors, and challenged Morgoth to come forth to single combat. And Morgoth came. As well as being a fan favourite passage, I think that Tolkien himself, as you might well imagine, also enjoyed this whole section a lot as well. The comparison to Orome was repeated in The Return of the King, towards the end of the chapter The Ride of the Rohirrim, when King Theoden of Rohan was borne up on Snowmane like a god of old, and then he was likened to Orome the Great. That doesn't seem to me to have been an accident. Tolkien is notorious for reusing unpublished material. Of course, the difference was that Theoden wasn't riding into battle alone. Fingolfin's eyes shining, like the eyes of the Valar, is another powerful piece of imagery. The power of his spirit makes Fingolfin's rage manifest. There's another parallel to be made here, one with Fingolfin's half-brother Feanor, whose death scene was also marked with a physical manifestation of his fiery spirit. We talked about the significance of that fire imagery at the time. Fingolfin's eyes shining reminds me of how we were told, back when they had first returned to the lands of Middle-earth, that the light of Aman was not yet dimmed in their eyes. As well as being very brave and fierce, and full of wrath, Fingolfin is falling victim to despair here as well, ultimately. We'll talk more about this aspect at the end of this sequence. I've noticed that fans on social media often cite this passage as being amongst their favourite pieces of prose in all of Tolkien's fiction. I love the rhythm of this passage leading up to Morgoth answering the challenge. It's simple but so effective. Tolkien hits us with a technique in which he strings together several simple clauses in succession, strung together with the and conjunctions, building tension with the cadence of the description of Fingolfin's mounting rage, before finishing on a simple sentence of 4 syllables. And Morgoth came. That was the last time in those wars that he passed the doors of his stronghold, and it is said that he took not the challenge willingly, for though his might was greatest of all things in this world, alone of the Valar he knew fear. But he could not now deny the challenge before the face of his captains, for the rocks rang with the shrill music of Fingolfin's horn, and his voice came keen and clear down into the depths of Angband. And Fingolfin named Morgoth Craven and Lord of Slaves. Therefore Morgoth came, climbing slowly from his subterranean throne, and the rumour of his feet was like thunder underground. And he issued forth, clad in black armour, and he stood before the king like a tower, iron-crowned, and his vast shield, sable unblazoned, cast a shadow over him like a storm cloud. But Fingolfin gleamed beneath it as a star, for his mail was overlaid with silver, and his blue shield was set with crystals, and he drew his sword Ringil, that glittered like ice. Then Morgoth hurled aloft Grond, the hammer of the underworld, and swung it down like a bolt of thunder. But Fingolfin sprang aside, and Grond rent a mighty pit in the earth, whence smoke and fire darted. Many times Morgoth essayed to smite him, and each time Fingolfin leaped away as a lightning shoots from under a dark cloud, and he wounded Morgoth with 7 wounds, and 7 times Morgoth gave a cry of anguish, whereat the hosts of Angband fell upon their faces in dismay, and the cries echoed in the Northlands. But at the last the king grew weary, and Morgoth bore down his shield upon him. Thrice he was crushed to his knees, and thrice arose again and bore up his broken shield and stricken helm. But the earth was all rent and pitted about him, and he stumbled and fell backward before the feet of Morgoth. And Morgoth set his left foot upon his neck, and the weight of it was like a fallen hill. Yet with his last and desperate stroke, Fingolfin hewed the foot with Ringil, and the blood gushed forth, black and smoking, and filled the pits of Grond. Sometimes you have to just simply say, what an incredible description of an epic, enthralling encounter. An entirely thrilling, pure high fantasy moment. A battle between 2 veritable titans, even if ultimately they prove to be mismatched in the end as combatants. Speaking of titans, there is something of the classical tradition in this battle between Fingolfin and Morgoth. It reminds many readers of the famous duels of Homer's Iliad, Menelaus and Paris, Ajax and Hector, Hector and Achilles. But duels of single combat are fought in many other cultures. The early medieval Scandinavian world, which we know that Tolkien was particularly moved and inspired by, had a tradition called the Holmgang, a kind of Viking trial by combat, which was used to settle disputes. The duel of Fingolfin and Morgoth wasn't a private legal proceeding, of course, but a brutal fight to the death between 2 opposing champions and leaders in a military conflict. More like the duels of the Greek heroes in Troy, in that sense. Perhaps a more appropriate comparison from the Norse world would be Thor's duel with the Jotun Hrungnir, which is retold from earlier legends within the pages of the prose Edda. Even the ground is split apart by the weapons of the two combatants, similarly to the pits of Grond, according to earlier accounts of this myth, from which Snorri Sturluson claimed to have based his version from. None of this is to suggest that Tolkien was directly inspired by this legend, or any other in particular, but I do think that the spirit of Fingolfin's challenge to Morgoth is more Norse in flavour than it is Hellenic. I'll elaborate a little on why I think this in my conclusion, as we should continue the reading. So Fingolfin died under Morgoth's boot, but there is a small victory within the defeat. He wounded Morgoth 7 times, and was able to match up to the Dark Lord until he became too tired to evade Grond. No one else could have done more. And even when Fingolfin was trampled under the foot of Morgoth, he drew blood with one last desperate strike. Let's read the resolution of this confrontation. Thus died Fingolfin, High King of the Noldor, most proud and valiant of the elven kings of old. The orcs made no boast of that duel at the gate, neither do the elves sing of it, for their sorrow is too deep. Yet the tale of it is remembered still, for Thorondor, king of eagles, brought the tidings to Gondolin, and to Hithlum afar off. And Morgoth took the body of the elven king, and broke it, and would cast it to his wolves. But Thorondor came hasting from his eyrie among the peaks of the Chrysaegrim, and he stooped upon Morgoth, and marred his face. The rushing of the wings of Thorondor was like the noise of the winds of Manwë, and he seized the body in his mighty talons, and soaring suddenly above the darts of the orcs, he bore the king away. And he laid him upon a mountain top that looked from the north upon the hidden valley of Gondolin, and Turgon, coming, built a high cairn over his father. No orc dared ever after to pass over the mount of Fingolfin, or draw nigh his tomb, until the doom of Gondolin was come, and treachery was born among his kin. Morgoth went ever halt of 1 foot after that day, and the pain of his wounds could not be healed, and in his face was the scar that Thorondor made. Remember what we were told about Morgoth earlier, that he alone of the Valar knew fear. He could not now deny the challenge before the face of his captains. One of the things that Morgoth must surely fear is the diminishment of the terror that he incites in others, which is the main source of the power that he has to influence his armies of slaves. That the orcs would make no boasts about the outcome of this duel should come as no great surprise. Think about what happened here. Fingolfin stood no chance of defeating Morgoth, yet managed to wound him 7 times in the battle. He afflicted him with a permanent limp, and to top it all off, Thorondor of the Great Eagles slashed at his face and scarred him. Morgoth literally lost face. The outcome of this battle was nothing but an embarrassment to Morgoth, and a demonstration of how much of his former strength he had lost. Tolkien gives us a little insight into the source of Morgoth's fear in Morgoth's Ring. The following is based on later writings, versions of the mythology that were drafted years after the bulk of the material that the 1977 Silmarillion was based upon. But this passage could still give us an idea of what motivated Morgoth's fears, at least as Tolkien came to see the character later on. In the essay entitled Notes on Motives in the Silmarillion, he writes, "To gain domination over Arda, Morgoth had let most of his being pass into the physical constituents of the earth. Hence all things that were born on earth and lived on and by it, beasts or plants or incarnate spirits, were liable to be stained. Morgoth at the time of the War of the Duels had become permanently incarnate. For this reason he was afraid, and waged the war almost entirely by means of devices, or of subordinates and dominated creatures. So this is the reason why Morgoth had neglected to leave Angband until this duel with the High King, and why he was so hesitant to do battle himself. Why he made himself a recluse and dwelt underground. This would be the last time that he would willingly leave his gates. This excerpt comes in the context of a comparison between Morgoth and Sauron's similar paths towards nihilism and evil. While Sauron reached the maximum of his potential midway through the Second Age with the forging of the Rings of Power, Tolkien tells us that the two Dark Lords were different in various ways. Morgoth was most potent and powerful right at the beginning of the physical universe, and lessened himself over time by exerting his influence in the physical world around him, into his slaves, his armies, and his machines of war. This is the same marring of ardour that I've referred to in previous installments in this series. This is the process by which Morgoth became and made himself vulnerable, and the reason that this bout with Fingolfin is closer than one might expect. I said before that I think Fingolfin's attitude a very northern one. It's very Norse. Aside from the quite obvious and well-documented influences in his work, superficial references such as the Old Norse names that we see in The Hobbit, and which were carried over to The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien had a particular admiration for the courage engendered by the myths of Norse and Germanic myth. In his 1936 Beowulf lecture, The Monsters and the Critics, Tolkien describes what he calls the fundamentally similar heroic temper of ancient England and Scandinavia, and refers to the fusion between the early Christian world in Western Europe and Germanic folk tales and legends, when he tells us that one of the most potent elements in that fusion is the northern courage, the theory of courage, which is the greatest contribution in early northern literature. The Tolkien scholar and medievalist Tom Shippey explains what Tolkien meant by the theory of courage in his essay Tolkien and the Appeal of the Pagan. He says that Tolkien did not mean that in Norse mythology courage was admired, as it is in all human traditions. He meant that Norse mythology was unique in confronting certain and ultimate defeat, but regarding that neither as an excuse for giving up, nor as a logical refutation of one's position. Evil will triumph, but it will still be evil. Fingolfin after the Dagor Bragollach saw certain and ultimate defeat in the Wars of Beleriand and the struggle with Morgoth. He saw no hope for the Eldar, no chance of military victory against the might of Angband. One could say that Fingolfin's spirit broke, and that he threw his life away in a meaningless melee, but the truth is more complicated than that. Fingolfin's decision is not that of Denethor in The Lord of the Rings, for instance. In Fingolfin's defiance, and his will to confront his enemy nonetheless, there is still much to be admired. The fact that the elves still tell the tale of Fingolfin's fall, and that the orcs make no boasts about his defeat, says something about the small victory that existed within this defeat. Fingolfin was succeeded as High King by his eldest son, Fingon. Fingon, you will remember, was the son who was best known until now for his friendship with Maedhros, and for his dramatic rescue of the Feanorian in Chapter 13. The account of the duel closes with a short, single-sentence paragraph about the change in leadership of the House of Fingolfin, and includes here the first mention of Gil-galad. His young son Ereinion, who was after named Gil-galad, he sent to the Havens. The Havens in question were the two havens of the Falas, Círdan the Shipwright's seat of power. at the time still virtually untouched by the war. Here and throughout the Silmarillion, it is stated that Gil-galad is the son of Fingon, but elsewhere Christopher Tolkien stated that this had been an editorial mistake on his part. Tolkien's final intent for the character was unclear, and it would have been better to have let the matter remain obscure. We're going to stop reading right there, but in the next video we will close out chapter 18 with the return of Barahir to Duathonion, and we will also be introduced to Hurin and Huor, two of the young men of Dor-lomin, of the House of Hador, who will find themselves in Turgon's realm of Gondolin. To make sure you don't miss that video, and to stay up to date with all of my uploads, make sure you're subscribed to Voice of Geekdom, and click the bell icon to turn on all notifications.
And my axe.
Thanks as always to my axe-wielding patrons. That's Erin M, Stephen Stark of Here Be Dragons, Kelly the Jaded Shipwright, Arvedui of Arnor, Joshua Boniface, and A.N. Kreutzberg. Thanks also to all of my patrons at Sword and Bow tiers.